Hello, I welcome you all into another episode of the Cosmic Matrix podcast, once again with your hosts Bernhard and Laura. Today's episode is about how can we be truly sovereign and free. So that's obviously a very important topic in light of what's happening in the world, in light of the previous episodes we have talked about how to navigate these times of chaos, division, and splitting, and the silver lining in all of it, right? There's a chance to decentralize, to become more, quote, sovereign, and not dependent on government. And for that, we need to organize ourselves and take care of ourselves. But we want to dive a bit deeper into this whole concept of sovereignty and freedom and even free will, because what we see now, a lot of people are organizing themselves. We recently attended an event where people meet up, talk about sovereignty and building community and taking care of themselves and decentralizing and all of that, as I just mentioned. So before we dive a bit deeper, I also want to talk about the definition of sovereign. Sovereign basically means, out of the dictionary, literally, possessing supreme or ultimate power. And sovereignty is freedom from external control, right? To become autonomy, basically. And the way autonomous. Yeah. Thank you. And the way we see it right now, it's mostly external, right? In that sense that people try to free themselves from government, from external control, obviously as the totalitarian, technocratic powers are clamping down. We want to free ourselves from the grip, from this enslavement, right? And that's also the whole ideology behind anarchism, which basically means no rulers. I mean, that's the true meaning of it. The word, anarchism or anarchist has also been very much distorted. Even they call Antifa anarchists, and this whole idea of chaos and violence, which has nothing to do with the true philosophy and ideology of anarchism, which ties more into voluntarism. You know, not to infringe the freedom on others and do not harm others, right? And voluntarily participate in society based on various principles. But I don't want to get too deep into the ideology of anarchism, because again, this is all these external ways and means of trying to decentralize, trying to become sovereign and free, right? And even anarchism is another ism. So there are all these kind of ideologies and ways of trying to exit the system, so to speak, on a physical external level. But what we really want to dive into is really, into the inner freedom. How much can you truly govern yourself, as it goes, or how much can you really extract yourself from government if you cannot truly govern yourself? And governing yourself meaning truly being aware of yourself and your all inner life, and how free are you truly within yourself, from your own conditioning, programming, wants, needs, and desires. So that's really what it comes down to, which ultimately also ties into the process of individuation.
Yeah, exactly. How can you talk about sovereignty if you yourself are not free and you're still being driven by your lower nature as well as conditioned, programmed desires? People are really easy to trigger these days. If you're easy to trigger, you're not sovereign though, because and I'm including myself in this. Like, there's still, people who get to me, especially in relationship, and I know that that's where I'm not free. I'm still living in a prison. Although I feel like for many people, because of what's going on collectively, we've had to go through a collective individuation process, because the consensus narrative has lost its mind, has deviated into tyranny / insanity / propaganda, brainwashing, all sorts of stuff. So it's actually, to some extent, at least on the intellectual level, it's forced people to think for themselves. Because you either have to go along with things that totally go against your own bodily sovereignty, or you have to start asking questions and quote unquote doing your own research, So there has been some level of intellectual individuation that's taken place through crisis, actually. So I think that's important to note. But I still notice a lot of people externalizing, just hating Bill Gates or whoever else, That's not free. That's not freedom in my view, It's like we need to have that essence of freedom within ourselves. Like, I can be who I am. I'm a unique individual. I know who I am. And really, it also comes down, which we'll get into later in the podcast, is the self needs to be the central resource. And for a lot of people, and I see this in the world, it's just like the conditioned ego personality is talking about freedom. The conditioned ego personality can't know freedom.
Exactly. I mean, that's also been my big, I've been also going back to anarchism. I was also talk at Acapulco a few years ago, 2017, 2018. I was even on Jeff Berwick's Anarchast podcast about anarchism many years ago. He's the founder of Acapulco, and he always opens the question to his guests, when have you become an anarchist? And I'd say right away that I don't identify myself as an anarchist, right? Because there's another trap in itself, this identification with the group. And anarchism itself, I can appreciate the ideology, but I see a lot of armchair anarchists in the sense making it, like you mentioned, this intellectual ideology, but they are not free themselves within themselves, right? In the sense, like as you just mentioned, they mistake also their ego personality for the self, for the true self.
Yes.
And that goes deeper, like into not only the psychological process of individuation, but deeper spiritual work to really realize the self, the true self, the essence, the psychic being.
And psychological work.
And exactly, and what you mentioned is very important to understand, that part that usually talks about freedom and we need to fight the system, and all of that comes actually from the conditioned ego personality.
Yes.
And I've seen in myself, I've mentioned that before in my writings as well as in various podcasts, that back in my, as I call my romantic anarchist days, was actually coming from my childhood wounding.
Yeah.
Also from my father wound, like the knee-jerk reaction against authority and all of that. And I'm not saying that we need to not submit to authority. It's not that black and white, but I can see within myself and many others that try now to fight the system, become sovereign, independent, and all of that. It's coming from a lot of the wounded inner child.
Yes.
And conditioning, programming in general, and unconscious trauma we all have carried to varying degrees. And it then informs, like you just mentioned, you're not free if you get triggered by other people and then you blame others. You're stuck in blame victim consciousness.
Yeah.
Then you're not truly free.
Yeah.
And then I'm just wondering, then people say, I know myself and, I'm an individual, but they mistake, like you just mentioned, the conditioned ego personality for the true self.
Yeah. Yeah, they'll say I know myself, like I'm this, I'm a lawyer, I'm a doctor, or whatever, that's not your true essence, And I think that true freedom really has to come from part of this individuation process, which is part of the Aquarius archetype. So I think Saturn's in Aquarius right now. I don't know. I don't pay attention to transits, but I know Saturn is Aquarius. I know we're nearing into Pluto in Aquarius, the quote unquote age of Aquarius. I believe personally that we're basically on the, we're between ages. We're kind of like, we have both the the Pisces Virgo axis and the Aquarius Leo axis. So we are collectively individuating in a sense. And I'm just going to share a little bit, about according the evolutionary astrology context for this individuation process. This is something I wrote actually in the group coaching program, Embodied Soul Awakening, to someone who asked a question about this. So according to evolutionary astrology, it's the most individuated / spiritualized souls who create the next consensus mainstream state. And you see that. These are the people who are the trailblazers, the visionaries. Jung was a highly individuated person, and they changed the consensus. But then look at even now, like Jung's concepts have not reached the consensus still, but they're reaching a mass, so they've spread out. So that's the point. But the point is that there's always been a violent backlash from the consensus state against anyone who rebels against it. So this backlash process eventually does lead to the integration of the new ideas that the individuated and spiritualized people brought into society, but the backlash must always come first. And there's something that happens, this astrologer Mark Jones actually referred to it as maximum alienation, maximum individuation. So there's an alienation process that actually comes when you separate from the herd and you remove yourself from the consensus, basically. And that's what a lot of people are going through right now. Like, old friends, family members, people that work, if you don't agree with the jab, you are on an individuation process because that's the consensus reality right now. So from moving from the consensus state, the mainstream, to the individuation state, is basically almost always, I would say, pretty much always a traumatic process for the individual. And the main reason why that is because they lose the sense of security of belonging to the consensus state that the consensus state provides. And also in the nature of the individuation process, it can also happen too much too fast. And the alienation can be traumatic because you don't have that like group belonging, be like, oh, I have similar ideas to you. That makes me feel safe in my ideas. No, if you're a truly individuated person, you can stand true to your values and beliefs. You don't need the group. Although, and this is something we're going to talk about, is that once you try to kind of distinguish your own true values, it's important to find like-minded people because you need a bunch of people to create a movement. You can't just do it alone. And a community,
right?
Exactly.
Basically creating without losing yourself again.
Exactly.
And I think
sorry, I just want to finish that quote. So this one way of resolving this feeling of alienation, which people kind of do, is to find true friendship with like-minded people. But it is really important to actually go through that process of alienation, because if you just try and find, so if you're seeking out community because you have a lot of childhood wounds coming up about not being seen, not being accepted by the consensus, what you're going to do is you're actually going to avoid the individuation process. Is you need to actually become an individual yourself, distinguish what are my true values, what's my vision of meaning of life, and then find like-minded others. But what a lot of people do is they don't actually individuate, and then they create a new consensus state within their own alternative ideas in order to give themselves that sense of validation.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to finish that quote. The truly individuated being will always be unique, ahead of their time. They're often cast out from the herd. That's the point, and it really is similar to this quote, if you don't fit into this world, it's because you're born to create a new one. It's like we really need to discover what makes us truly us, and really anchor that individuated essence within ourselves before we seek the others. Because if we're seeking the others as a way of seeking inner validation because other people share the same ideas as ourselves, it could still be driven by wanting to find another consensus state so that we can feel validated. So we're not actually individuating.
Yeah. Yeah, a couple of things on that note. So also not to mistake when people are the individual, we're not talking about a big ego, like a cult of personality. That's not an individuated being. That's still driven by social, cultural conditioning, programming, wounds, and on all kinds of mechanical behaviors. We're talking about the true individual in light of the Jungian process of individuation, or also in the spiritual context of connecting to true self-essence and making the personality or the ego a clear expression of essence, beyond any social, cultural conditioning, and also having worked through your shadow and wounds and traumas and all of that. But you made a really important point, exactly that's what we're seeing happening right now. And that has its purpose and process. We see there's a lot of people, it's happening with the people we work with in our program, Embodied Soul Awakening and whatnot. They're coming out of the consensus state and they're engaged, starting the individuation process. But as you mentioned, there are many traps within that, so to speak, to avoid it. And I think a big part, which I'm sure you alluded to, the individuation process, it's not an easy process because you need to also embrace loneliness.
Yes.
Right? You have to have this lonely,
you have to separate from the herd for a little bit.
And that's very important. Sri Aurobindo talked in his work as well, Integral Yoga, that the first step before you can even spiritualize, right? Even evolutionary astrology, Sri Aurobindo talked, before you go into the spiritual state, you need to be individuated. You need to, like he said, literally separated from a crowd and become a true individual.
Yes.
Which also paradoxically means to create a healthy ego, your healthy sense of self.
Yeah.
Right? So what we're seeing now, that's a paradox right now. With everything is happening, people are separating from friends and family, and they want like-minded people, and it's fine and good. We need that. But as you alluded to, there's a trap within that which can interfere with the individuation process, and we unconsciously look for another collective group consciousness to lag into to make ourselves feel better. And there's an excellent quote I want to share here from a book called The Ever-Transcending Spirit, The Psychology of Human Relationship, Consciousness, and Development by Toru Sato. And he says, insecurity and anxiety also motivates us to form and join groups. Being a part of a group relieves us of anxiety because it makes us feel like we're not the only ones who feel insecure about a particular thing. We often form groups with individuals who have similar insecurities. Having similar unconscious insecurities cause us to have similar desires from the perspective of the internal conflict model. Thus, the more insecure and anxious we are, the more motivated we are to form and maintain our own groups. And that's also like the basis on an ultimate level of cult-like behavior.
So I want to define individuation in a second, but I just want to share my own experience with that because I had joined an intentional community, permaculture community. We grew our own food, and it did support me in my individuation process, but not in the way that I thought. So what happened is like I joined this community, very alternative, lots of hippies, people involved in the permaculture movement, and we had these sharing circles every day. And this was my first kind of experience because I was like working in hospitality before, like waiting tables. I was really back in the consensus just out of pure survival mode. I had to make money, and then so I moved to this intentional community and we have these sharing circles every day. And I was getting into all these esoteric / spiritual topics, and I would talk about them in the sharing circles. And what I realized is that even though I could talk about it more openly than I could talk about it in the consensus state, there was still a unique part of me which could never be understood or explained by the community that I was in. And so it kind of, even though I thought like I kind of fell into that trap, I was like, oh, these are a bunch of people who are into the same things I'm interested in. They want to create this new earth, There was something still very unique that was very different about me, and that's what really jumpstarts the individuation process is we realize that there's a part of you that cannot be explained or mirrored by any group. And that's your individual self. So I'm going to just define it just so we have like a context. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is by Ruth Williams, a Jungian psychologist. So she defines the individuation process. We have a purposive function in life and can consciously work towards becoming more authentic. Individuation is a process by which we become separate psychological individuals, distinct from all others. Jung uses the term individuation to denote the process by which a person becomes a psychological individual that is a separate, indivisible unity or whole. That is quite different from individualism, which is ego-led, as opposed to self-led individuation. It is important to mark oneself out as different, which may be well necessary at times. Acting from self is regarded as an achievement, as the path towards individuation involves an enhancement of the personality, which builds a greater sense of who we are as unique individuals. Individuation is not a process to be forced or induced any more that you can rip a seedling out of the ground to hurry along its growth. Both have to unfold organically by the grace of God. Individuation points to the process, Jung tells us, whereby the acorn becomes an oak, the calf a cow, and the child an adult. It is the unfolding of our destiny. By this, I do not intend to imply that it is inevitable that we follow the path of our destiny. Many people never find their purpose in life. It involves arduous psychological work to find and incarnate the paths in life which we need to follow to fulfill our potential. And that's the critical point, is that there are many people who will not individuate, at least in this lifetime. They are not actually doing that work to discover, like, who am I beyond my conditioning?
And the soul might not be ripe for it in light of the soul path, and level of being. I have to have a certain consecutive lifetimes, and the soul needs to be a certain ripeness when it makes its, because individuation process, we can talk about this later as well. You can see it from the Jungian perspective. And it's a great, by the way, differentiation between the individual and individuation in a sense, right? Or the individuality, because it's egocentric versus really individuation, bringing forth the true self or bringing forth essence, the psychic being, right? Making then the personality a clear channel and vessel for the true self, for essence.
Can I just add one more thing onto that, though?
Yeah, go ahead.
So that's a really important step. So we have this like Capricorn / Saturn level of reality. This is all the conditioning factors of society that we're actually seeing kind of fall down right now, right? And what happens is when you reach this Aquarius / 11th house / Uranian level of reality, the self becomes the central resource, basically. So it's not the ego personality, it's the self becomes a central resource. So just, I'm just going to, so some, there's many different ways, like, so there's two different types of self. There's lowercase self and then there's capital self. I'm not talking about the capital self, what the yogis and the enlightened gurus talk about self-realization. That's capital self. But I'm talking about the part of yourself that, is like a unifying principle psychologically. Richard Schwartz, who does internal family systems, actually has a description of the self. He just calls it the 8 C's. It means when you're in self energy, you're curious, you're calm, you're clear, you feel connected, you feel confident, you feel courageous, you feel creativity and compassion. Yeah. So that seems true. Like when I know I'm in my true essence, that's how I feel.
So let's talk about the work of individuation process itself, what it means. And I have a great one-liner quote by Carl Jung. And he says, individuation is to divest the self of false wrappings. Mm-hmm. And that's really what the work is about, the great work, or what we also call the fourfold approach of holistic self-work, meaning working on all levels, physical, emotional, psychological, and then eventually spiritual as well. But what it means, really, what he says, in order to truly individuate and find the true self, you need to divest the self of false wrappings, meaning letting, working through all the layers of conditioning, wounding, trauma, your shadow, and all of that.
Yes.
Right? Because again, as I mentioned before, people talk about sovereignty and all of that. We need to, decentralize and create community and have a conscious community and all of that. But I've seen this time and again in all communities. I was also part of the scene come and go of people who are not engaged in this inner work and externalize some sort of sovereignty or wanting to decentralize, but they're still, they want to become their own authority, and don't have government, anybody telling what to do, but they're still slave to their own unconscious trauma and wounds and even desires that have been still programmed into them or coming out of insecurity or on the basic, just coming from the lower egoic nature, and all of that, which they don't question. So, I forgot who said that, but I had another teacher talked about also the problem with anarchism in this day and age, this intellectual ideology of anarchism. It becomes then, if you don't do the inner work to really individuate, just another vessel for your own egoic desires, right? Mm-hmm. Under the wrapping of just, I'm sovereign, I can do whatever I want.
Totally.
Right.
Yeah.
And you can still, even though if you follow the principles, of not harming anyone, but you're still slave to on your unconscious drives. And that's really the great work. So that's why we always say, especially in this day and age, yes, be around like-minded people, but that's not enough. We need to be around people who are engaged in the same work. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, any community, any organization will disintegrate and then also be taken over by Wetiko, by forces that truly, also influence us from unseen realms, because they tag into all of that. And we see this again and again, you know what I mean? People have highly intellectual knowledge about, how to decentralize, become sovereign externally, but they're still kind of a child in an adult suit that become easily triggered, take things personally in all these things. There's all kinds of, that kind of pollutes all of that.
Yeah, it's
so
kind
to
of
speak,
like,
right?
It reminds me, I kind of eavesdrop on you watching like these Bitcoin guys, and the crypto community. It's like, I feel like, the system in itself has the capacity to be a really amazing tool to give power back to the people, decentralization. But at the same time, it's like these people are getting rich off of crypto, and they're like buying Lamborghinis and it's nothing bad about that, by the way, but they're still being driven. It's like, why do you it's like
extreme materialism?
Yeah.
Right?
It's like they're still actually being driven by the consensus wants and needs or societal cultural programming. This is what success means,
Right.
And really missing the point. And I do think that, we are being called to engage in this process of collective individuation, which is the first step to any collective profound psycho-spiritual awakening. It has to include this individuation process. And it is painful. The way that I feel about it, especially if you have to one of the most tribal kind of needs we have of belonging is within our family, So when you realize that there's something different about you that doesn't relate to any of your family conditioning, it can almost feel like a baby losing its its mother, like that's the level of like kind of tribal conditioning we have around our blood family sometimes. Some people not. I know that you're a different case, but that's what it feels like. So if your family is like super pro vax and you're not into that, and then you have to go against them, that is a painful process. But I have to say that is a necessary pain. It's part of the individuation process, because that's an important step where you realize that there's something within you that is unique, which cannot be explained by your DNA, your family, your ancestry. There's something that's very uniquely you.
So how can we approach this in a practical manner? Because there's a paradox, there's a bit of a conflict, right? This is really an opportunity to engage in the process of individuation, what's happening right now in the way you just laid it out as well, to embrace loneliness, who am I? Asking the ultimate question, who am I? And work through these layers,
who am I beyond all of my conditioning,
where my desires come from, and all of that, understanding in depth, understanding the concept of triggers and projection. That's key in any community to really nail that down, by the way.
And then I have to say, the precursor to even understanding triggers and projections is first having a connection to your own body.
Right.
Because a lot of people don't even realize that they're triggered, and they just intellectually justify it right away.
Right. It's very mechanical.
It's Yeah.
But that's a very good point. So how can we reconcile this? Because as I said, we need to engage in the process of individuation without, like you said, fall into the trap of using the group again as a substitute for our insecurities, right? And losing ourselves again within the group hive mind of another group, even if it's an alternative group, right? So by the same time, we live in the time where it is important, right, to connect with like-minded, to build community. It's even the natural drive to connect. So because we need to do the work simultaneously, right? It's not about no man is an island. It's not and by the way, there's another paradox. You cannot individuate yourself by yourself. You need relating in order to individuate. And there's another great, whose work I can also recommend, James Hilleman. He's a young a psychologist as well, and he said something great. He asked the question, how can we know ourselves by ourselves? He goes on, souls need intimate connection, not only to individuate but simply to live. For this we need relationships in the profoundest kind through which we can realize ourselves, where self-revelation is possible, where interest in and love for soul is paramount. So that's another paradox, because that's another thing I want to also address with this whole idea of being sovereign and independent. If you just externalize it, you fall into another trap, because you can never be truly sovereign and independent. Yes. Only the ego, the tyrant within, thinks it's independent from everything else. But ultimately, truth is everything is connected and interrelated.
Yeah, this illusion of separation.
Exactly.
I think that often people who talk about sovereignty can still fall into this illusion that yes, there is something very unique about you as a soul that can't be explained by culture, by family, by society. But at the same time, you are, you're interconnected to your neighbor as much as you may not want to be, like we have these hidden connections. But I think it's like, Ruth Williams described it. Individuation is a process of transformation involving both conscious intent to change and develop, as well as unconscious drives, differentiating what does and does not fit into our over totality as a person. So I do think it is a process of, at first, shadow work, making the darkness conscious, like analyzing your own inner nature, asking questions. Where does this come from? Is this who I truly am? Has this been conditioned into me? And that's an ongoing process, not something you just read one book on it and then you're done. Like you have to constantly be analyzing this. Like, where does this come from?
Not just analytical, but through your body.
Yeah. It has to include the body in some way or form, but it's also just a process of kind of unpacking your own psyche, And I have to say, if your mind is in chaos, racing all the time, which is a lot of people, it's nothing bad. Like that's what meditation is meant to train you to do, to still the mind, or any mind body practice, right? Is that this chaos inside your own psyche will be reflected in your outer world, whether it's actually happening or not. It will through your perceptual filters. So I think there has to be some way of kind of like calming your nervous system, learning the basic aspect of presence before you can even begin that process. Because I just noticed with a lot of people, and even myself included, before I really got into meditation, is that like the mind is insanity, like what's going on in people's minds all the time, and the inner dialogue that a lot of people have, you know?
Yeah.
And so that is all, it's like, imagine like all these sub-personalities that are conditioned by previous events, even past lifetimes that have developed within yourself. It's like, that's the first thing to witness, is how many parts of yourself which are actually not the true self, which are all going crazy in there, you know?
Which we mistake for the true self.
Yes, exactly. And I know, you know, both Richard Schwartz talks about it. I don't know if Jung talked about sub-personalities, but this other guy, Robert Asioglu, who's like also kind of doing similar psycho-spiritual theories. But there are basically, you know, there's the self, and then there's all these things which are not self. And all these things which are not self are basically these sub-personalities which operate in our psyche. And we identify often with these sub-personalities rather than the self. You know, the self becomes very obscured over time.
That's why even Gurdjieff always talked, you know, he talked about this, even this number, you know, we have all these 987 false eyes, sub-personalities. It's just an esoteric number, not to maybe even taken literal.
Yeah.
But what's the real I, the true self?
Yes.
Because we identify with parts. You can see, even for the listener, observe yourself. You know, if you're really objective, you're a very contradictive being with all kinds of contradictive desires. One part wants this, the other part wants that, and this wants this. And it's very paradoxical. What is the true self? You know what I mean? The true self is actually none of this. It's buried behind all these voices, which are mostly highly socially cultural conditioning, in, you know, your unconscious voice of your mom or your dad, or all kinds of other traumas and childhood wounds that coming to surface and want to compensate, or be compensated, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I think number one, like, you know, the individuation process involves some process of self-analyzation, you know, whether you're disciplined enough to do it by yourself. I highly recommend like some sort of mirroring coach.
There's only so much self-work you can do by yourself. Yeah,
there's only so much self-work you can do by yourself. Yeah. And, you know, it does take a certain type of person, a very disciplined person, a very honest person. But even then, you know, there's so many ways that we get used to lying to ourselves.
Oh, yes.
And in fact, you know, the thing that we most hide from. So if you're the type of person who does self-work on your own, I was that person for a really long time. I didn't actually start engaging with a therapist until like last year, basically, consistently. Although I worked with like healers and teachers sporadically over time. So I wasn't completely alone, you know. But I have to say, when I'm in like a conversation, whether it's you or like meeting up with friends or whatever, is like I get to know myself in a deeper way, which I hadn't known before, because there's lots of our parts of ourselves, which are exactly the place that we need to look, that we're so used to hiding from, that we can only learn about that part of ourselves when we're in a relationship. Like we're very clever in the way that we hide the parts of ourselves that we don't want to look at, you know,
especially over time.
And especially when doing self-work on our own, you know, it's like we can be very clever, be like, oh, I'll look at everything except for this one thing, you know, and we do that unconsciously. So that's why it is important to have mirroring, and also to find your, you know, like really just spend time by yourself, like find out, what's my vision of meaning for life? What do I truly value, you know? Because a lot of us tend to like meet up with groups based on like almost like false values or false visions, you know? Like for me, I really want to see a more psychologically, spiritually awake world, you know? So but the thing that I'm most drawn to in groups and communities is if they're focused on that. And so I know that that's true for me.
And people who embody that as well.
Yeah, right? Exactly. So I know that that's true for me. So that helps me kind of, because that's the 11th house Aquarius kind of thing, is like-minded people. Which mind are you talking about? But like, what is your true vision? You know, like, have you spent enough time alone? Have you really asked yourself these deeper questions to understand that, you know? Because many of us are like, oh, I just want to see like an awake, compassionate, kind humanity. It's like, okay, but like, number one, is that your true vision? Meaning, are you living it out yourself? Because a lot of people also have these ideals in their head, and then they're not actually, you know.
Yeah,
it's a mental concept. It's not something, because if it's a really true vision of meaning in your life, you will be like super passionate about doing that in your own life. You won't just talk about it, you know. And
that's a trap. I mean, that's also again a paradox, but this whole trap of like, oh, just I want to be around like-minded people, you know. Even on social media, you know, which can become an echo chamber, and you're like-minded because you have an intellectual common understanding, and you get a dopamine hit from exchanging information, agreeing with people, right? but that's not enough.
Yes.
You know, and then you can get lost in that become like can become a a group hive mind in itself, and you can lose your individuality to begin with. And going back to the question of this podcast, how can we be truly sovereign and free? I can tell you right away, you can do all like, create a community that is sovereign, decentralized, completely self-sustainable, and you have your own currency, crypto, all the bags and whatnot, completely decentralized. You have financial freedom, all of that. And you may seem externally free and sovereign, from the external matrix. But if you have not done any work on yourself whatsoever, you're still a slave to your own unconscious needs, wants, and desires. If you have still any desires, wants, and needs you're attached to, you're not free. Your own compulsions, you may even normalize, even sexual urges, desires, pathologies, and fetishes, you may normalize and just go about mechanically. Then you're not free.
Yes.
Right? That's why in esoteric traditions, they always talk about spiritual tradition, or in Buddhism is also in many others mirrored as well, that desire leads to suffering. And that doesn't mean not to have desires and go rejecting the world and going to the path of the aesthetics and denying the physical world. No, we can enjoy the riches of the physical world, but can you be at the same time be detached from the desires, right? Mm-hmm. Because most people operate very mechanically, unconsciously, being slave to their desires and wants and needs, what they think they want anyway. Yes. And this is going to then poison any community whatsoever if that individuation process is not approached consciously in light of the inner work. Mm-hmm. And that needs to go hand in hand, Yeah. You see it even in light of the evolution of consciousness. People forget that, the outer world is a reflection of our inner state. The reason why people are still governed by government,
because they can't govern
because themselves. They cannot govern anything themselves. Can you govern yourself? Meaning, are you fully in control of yourself?
Yeah. Yeah.
And do you truly know yourself?
That is extremely hard. I know that I can't, like when I have really strong projections come up, like I'm a very emotional person. So they have an extreme emotional charge. They can be extremely convincing. And this is with I know how to work with projections. I know how to work through them, but I'm just saying the psychic energy and charge of our own unconscious when it comes to surface via a trigger or a projection or whatever you want to call it is extremely strong. And I do believe it really takes a certain amount of soul to witness that and to just notice it and to be curious about it, because to the extent that it's actually holding unresolved emotional content versus about childhood traumas and wounds is to the extent that we can actually be driven to act from those places, So I see that all the time. I mean, we're all trying to become, or not we're all, but many of us are trying to become kind of masters of all the material that's arising from the collective unconscious right now. And we have our own personal journey within that. And it's very easy right now to fight the shadows on the wall. There's many of us who have a lot of unresolved content, a lot of trauma we haven't processed. And it becomes very easy to be like, okay, let me just hate Bill Gates and just hate these figures. We are projecting our own unresolved wounds from childhood on the outer world, whether it's Bill Gates or, Biden. It's like Biden isn't even there anymore. He's not a good target for your projections to begin with.
He's
what
out
I'm
of
saying
control
is
anyway.
that, any time that you have, it's an interesting paradox, because I notice this in myself all the time. I'm also going through a lot of really intense transits where a lot that dictate that a lot of personal and conscious material is coming up, and it does take all of my emotional, psychological, and spiritual strength to sometimes notice these projections and not act on them. And I still make mistakes pretty much every other day. So I mean mistakes is I still act out my projections, but I have to say, and I think we talked about it in the previous podcast, but when you withdraw your projections from the outer world, you gain your self energy back. And that's the key point, is the moment that you're blaming someone out there for how you feel, the way the world is, you are projecting. And that's hard. It is really hard because it's really seductive. And when everyone else is doing it, you know, when everyone else is doing it, it's easy to start doing it too. You know, you start to be almost
shadow
like
dancing.
The only sober, if you start to withdraw your projections, you're like the only sober person at a bar of drunk people, you know?
And also if there are projections from an occult level, occult esoteric level, you also turn off the food source for these occult forces.
Yes.
Because the hostile forces, the archonic forces that feed on humanity, they feed off of your projections. They feed off the emotional illusion, all of that, what most people participate in unconsciously.
Yes.
And the work is easier said than done. Like you, I'm not free of projections and triggers. You know, if anybody who claims to be done, by the way, I want to point this out because a lot of people say, oh, I've done shadow work for so long, I'm done with it. You know, anybody who claims who's done with shadow work has on their projections triggers, that's equally to be saying that they have self-realized themselves, aka enlightened.
And why be done with it? Like, that's the question is like, you don't like just, it's like people who like go to meditation retreat for like 1 week and then they're like, oh, I did my meditation, I know how to do this. It's like, this is an ongoing process. Like, you know, chop wood, carry water, just keep on doing the inner work. New stuff will come up every day in this kind of chaotic environment, you know? Yeah. So we can't avoid it. And it actually like, you know, and we said this in many different podcasts, is like, this is the best time to work on yourself. Like, you know, when things are too calm and things are too like kind of like normal and safe and comfortable, it's like, we don't often engage in the process. But then, you know, like your grandmother or mother calls you, be like, I'm not going to talk to you unless you get the vax. And all these emotions of abandonment come up from childhood. That's the moment to start doing the work. Exactly. It's like, this is the ripe material. Like sometimes I go to like my therapist and like I don't have anything to say because nothing has really happened of like, or I've sorted it out myself. But I do know the moment when shit happens and I have something to talk about, I was like, whoa, this is an extremely ripe moment to start working this through. This is the time is now, you know? So we have to almost develop this attitude towards our own inner work. And like, this almost like tenaciousness where we're like, I'm going to go there now, you know, and we miss opportunities all the time doing that when we project.
Exactly. But like you said, and we've said this before, this time when right now, the splitting of humanity, this intensity right now, this is perfect fertile ground to do the great work. It's a silver lining. It's an opportunity to answer the call. And it's not going to be easy work. There are many traps and distractions, temptations. And one of the distractions, temptation is just to latch on, you know, just find external groups to latch on again without doing the inner work. Yeah. And that will just give you maybe a quick release, like a dopamine hit, similar to that. But, you know, the key point is to engage in this individuation process consciously in all of it while building community at the same time. So needs to happen hand in hand. Yeah. So you don't use the group as a substitute for your own insecurities again, right? Yeah. And skip the individuation process because it's not a comfortable process, right? And we always like to avoid pain and gravitates towards pleasure in all of that. So it needs to go hand in hand together. Like I said, it is important, like we mentioned this before, activism, organize ourselves, decentralize, you know what I mean? Communicate, network, and all of that. But there's a danger in losing yourself in that by externalizing everything and not using it also as an opportunity for this inner work, true inner individuation process to find your true self. So you can be truly yourself. You can, the ultimate goal is, so to speak, to be completely individuated, connect with others in community, right? But you are your own sovereign being.
Yes, yeah.
In the true meaning of the word.
Yeah, and I think of, you know, of our group programs, you know, because people do initially join them because they want belonging, they want community. But I think that then the big question comes up is like, you know, you realize that there's something unique about you that can't be described about any community. So you can't go looking for belonging there. Like it's more better to actually treat the community as like a mirror. Like these are a bunch of different relationships. They can mirror how you are, how you aren't. And I'm going to share this quote by Marie-Louise von Franz, who's also a Jungian psychologist. And she talks about this. It is useless to cast furtive glances at the way someone else is developing because each of us has a unique task of self-realization. Although many human problems are similar, they are never identical. All pine trees are very much alike, otherwise we should not recognize them as pines. Yet none is exactly the same as another. Because of these factors of sameness and difference, it is difficult to summarize the infinite variations of the process of individuation. The fact is that each person has to do something different, something that is uniquely his own.
Yes.
And so, you know, you can
That's a key point.
Like I kind of see it. It's like if you join a psycho-spiritual self-help group, like we're running, like it's like you'll see that, you may all be kind of like have similar aims, but your journey and the things that you need to do may be so radically different
It's
to
very
someone
unique.
else, so you got to also embrace that and not like get into this like, what we can do in relationship is get into this like kind of trap of comparison. Like I should be like this person is doing this person is getting this out of their process or whatever. No, we're each very uniquely different in that sense. And I think it's no coincidence that like astrology shows us the most how different we are as people. And astrology is also ruled by Uranus, Aquarius, the individuation process. So they go hand in hand, and the more that we actually honor our own unique individuality, the less we actually will care if this person agrees with us about everything. We will actually honor the individuality in other people as well. And I think that's also what I see in groups. There's a lot of like infighting too, where like, it's like, like you agree with someone about like 90% of things, but then the 10% of things is like you other them, you fight against them. You don't want them to be an individual actually.
And I think also the individuation process also ties into the trap of, you let go of identifications. You can relate to these people. I've mentioned many times, I support patriots, right now, the American, all of that, but I don't identify as one. This is all that I wrote an article about this trap of identification, which usually happens with groups. So I am a Republican, I'm a Democrat, I'm a patriot, whatever it may be.
Yes.
You identify with a group, that's already like a hindrance in your individuation process. It doesn't mean that you can have certain values that what these groups represent and whatnot, but even identify the biggest irony is like if people identify as an anarchist, because that right away, stifles your own freedom because you have identified with a certain concept, with a certain ism, So a true free human being, an individual self, is not identified with these labels.
Yes,
even though we can work with them, relate to them, and apply them, right?
Yeah.
And before we end, we're almost at the end of the first hour. So we're going to go deep into that in the second hour, also from a more spiritual perspective. And we also want to talk about how, obviously, what we're seeing right now with the New World Order, socialism, Marxism, this is actually the threat to the individual. And that's also why the anti-divine force is using these ideologies in the disease of collectivism and globalism to eradicate the individual, right? And just put them into group identities. But I want to share something which I wrote 5 years ago in an article, Timeline, Reality Split, and the Hidden Forces of Life, where I talk about the individual, the sovereign individual, and the process of individuation, and not to mistake it as being independent, right? Because that's the externalizing of this process. So individuality in the deeper meaning of the sense, even the process of individuation, in this context, or also from a spiritual perspective, is the embodied individualized soul as a conscious transducer for higher energies, which that's what we talk about in the second half as well, which means aligning with divine will, because ultimately we are a child of God. We are, need to surrender to God. So that's like, we're not separate from God, but we need to be a channel for divine will, which also relates to essence, right? So being a quote instrument for divine will. So individuality does not mean what many people mistake it as ego personality identification, the false I, or what the matrix or official culture promotes as, quote, individuality, which is most often a cult of personality. I think that relates to the quote, what you mentioned before. There's a differentiation between the individuated person and the individual, which is the ego personality, right? So, and then it goes on in the same context, becoming a sovereign, emancipated individual does not imply that one is an independent human being, separate from everything else. This is very important to understand. This illusory idea stems from the overriding head-centric male aspect of consciousness, the inner tyrant, who is identified with self-achieved false independence, right? Even what people talk about in the crypto and financial independence, freedom is fine and good, but that can be the trap in itself, because you can be, if you're still slave to your own desires and all of that. So from a spiritual and holistic perspective, being a sovereign embodied individual is based upon a deep recognition on an embodied level, not intellectual level, of the interrelationship of life, fully tuned into the nature and divine spirit as an individualized, right? Individuated, but not separate expression of it all. A fractal aspect of the universal hologram, right? It also stems from the feminine aspect of consciousness, which is grounded in being. So a truly sovereign, emancipated individual, individual in that sense, is then not influenced by external influences, intrusions, of which the matrix attempts to insert into their consciousness. And any form of rulers or authority, including hyperdimensional occult interference or social cultural programming or spiritual conditioning. But he or she is also not an isolated, independent, and separate being, but deeply connected to and alignment with nature, spirit, and divine, your true self, as a conscious transducer and vessel for the divine. So that's, I think, also relates to what you said before, right? You see there's a state of being, you see the interrelationship of it all, right? How spirit in light of the evolution works through everything and everyone, how everybody is a unique individual doing their part with all the distortions, conditioning, and wounding. That's still part of it, right? But you see your place in that as well, and that's why what you mentioned beautifully as well, that we all have a unique part, and there's a danger like in these communities where everybody needs to become a farmer and grow food and all of this. No, everybody, the more you individuate, the more you also actually deeper connect to your deeper purpose.
Yes.
And so purpose, your latent powers and talents you're not being aware of because it's buried behind layers of conditioning, wounding, or socially cultural conditioned desires, aims that are not even your own, or insecurities, trauma, and all of that. So the more we individuate, the more we find our true place in the world.
Yes.
Without needing to compete, actually.
Yeah.
Right? Competition goes out of the window in that sense, because you're completely secure in yourself. You know who you are. You know what you need to do.
Yeah.
You don't compare yourself.
Yeah.
And that's, the more people align to that, that's actually then how a true idealized society on a high level, how true anarchism, voluntarism would work if everybody's truly individuated.
Yes. And I really, we talk about this the second hour, but I really noticed, just to add on, that you make decisions for yourself a lot easier. Like, you may ask people for mirroring, for feedback, but you're just like, no, this is bright. You just feel connected to that essence in you.
Yeah. Beautiful. So let's go deeper into that in the second hour. And once again, if you're not a member yet, the second hour is only for members. You can sign up at my website, veilofreality.com. Gives you access to all the second hours of all the podcasts, including the membership forum. And we'll see you guys in the second hour. Until then.